I want to address the state of kind of radical politics and Antifa and Black Lives Matter in the current context. Um, Certainly after the tragic event involving George Floyd, um, the Black Lives Matter movement managed to spring into the mainstream in a very, very overwhelming way, I guess you'd have to say, and led to mass protests and riots. And it mixed in with this, of course, was other aspects of radicalism, the Antifa groups, which are loosely organized cells throughout the country of extreme neo-Marxist extremists, perhaps even in some cases actual anarchists. Um, and of course, Black Lives Matter, which itself was founded after the Trayvon Martin incident in Florida back in 2012, and has continued to gain prominence, and I suppose funding from a variety of extreme groups. Probably the Soros people and other people of that ilk have been funneling money through it through surrogates for some time. But of course, with the Floyd incident, we have major corporations supporting this at the same time, even though this is clearly a Marxist organization with a truly radical agenda at heart. Although I think most of the followers at the local levels probably don't fully realize what they're supporting. And certainly a lot of the people in the protests, I'm sure, have no concept. But essentially, the key practical element that they're promoting at this time is the idea of fighting the police forces, defunding or limiting to the degree possible police forces, including such moves. There have been cases where judges and local councils have tried to reduce the ability of police forces to use non-lethal means of riot control, such as banning tear gas or various kinds of rubber bullets or whatever, things that are less than lethal. And I think in some cases now it's been reversed in areas because it's obviously a ridiculous policy. So where we are right now, I think the mass protests have largely died down, and to what degree that led to the spike in the coronavirus epidemic in the summer is hard to tell. I think it was a contributor, but probably not the whole event. One has to also ask, what were all these people doing when they weren't out protesting? I mean, were they actually isolated and home, or were they actually having other meetings where they were indoors, potentially not, taking proper precautions? Plus, I think at the same time, with the reopening of the economy and a lot of other people seeing everybody else going out, decide we can go out and do whatever we want to do too, party or do other activities. So at any rate, we have had the virus spike out of that, and I would like to mention that I think that that's part of the problem we've had in the summer. But getting back to the key issue here, the fact of the matter is Black Lives Matter as such and their defund the police movement is really against the interests of the African American community, particularly those that are not have not moved up economically into the suburbs and so forth. Those are still at lower economic levels, living in depressed neighborhoods where there's a lot of crime. You have to realize that if you reduce the police presence, it'll simply empower all the criminals. And we saw that during the riots, that when the police were kind of forced to stand down by the magnitude of all the protests, all sorts of criminals came out of the woodwork who obviously had no real political agenda. They had a personal agenda to take and get whatever they could. And so we see the spikes in murder rates in major cities, of course, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, and so forth. So this indicates this movement actually, of course, has taken more black lives than it's ever saved. And it's a very ridiculous situation to have major corporations funding these people who have objectives that ultimately are inconsistent with the corporation's objectives. I presume they think they're going to buy peace or some favor in the short term. At any rate, then we have another aspect of this whole situation is this Antifa group, which apparently is more loosely organized into cells, sort of like a resistance movement during an occupied, occupied France, during World War II, in a sense, or communist cells in a revolutionary movement, however you want to say it. The idea is that it isn't really centrally controlled and directed, but it sort of springs up in local groupings that then coordinate with each other. So that's very difficult to actually, pin the blame on some specific command structure. And so what you end up doing is, in a rioting situation, perhaps arrest certain key perpetrators, the person that threw the Molotov cocktail or the person that threw an explosive device or whatever. But the ultimate ringleaders of this sort of thing become very obscure and hard to capture. And of course, behind it all, the wealthy leftists that are funding it are hidden behind tiers of other organizations so that they're not directly involved. You won't actually find a check with George Soros' signature on it in the hands of an Antifa member. There'll be intermediary groups that will handle that situation for them, which makes it hard to deal with legally, obviously. And but what also is this dovetails with something else that we see in the Democratic Party, which is their continual use of the race weapon in this thing, which I think needs to be completely rejected. The simple matter of fact is, I think that the number of actual real racists today is, at least among the conservative white community, is pretty small. This idea that all these groups and the Democrats, for instance, in the recent meeting with Ted Cruz before the Senate, were continually referring to all these so-called white supremacist groups. And I think the concept of white supremacy, which was certainly the way the Jim Crow South operated for many decades after the Civil War, I think is essentially gone. I think that by the early 80s, I think this idea had just simply vanished. I think there are groups that are racially motivated and so forth, but I don't think it evolves around any concept of either legal or other type of supremacy of one race over the other. I don't think that is even a valid idea anymore. And yet the Democrats are throwing this out even more extremely than they would have, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when there was probably more relevance to it. I mean, I think today it's essentially vanishingly small. And even when you talk about terrorist incidents from the far, if you want to call it right, I don't even know if there's an ideology, it generally seems to be actions of disturbed individuals rather than a group operation. And so, but on the other hand, the Antifa and the BLM are group operations and do have a national presence that's very significant. And I think that constitutes a much greater threat to the future of the country, particularly because I think it continues to promote racial division. And I think the real racism, if there is any, is those that seize to use race as a divisive tactic in order to brand other people as racist who aren't, in order to achieve political advantage. And I think it creates a degree of maybe even paranoia, and certainly the current situation with the police is another example. The police, the whole theme of Black Lives Matter seems to say, well, somebody out there doesn't care about black lives, and implying that somebody's killing black people. Well, actually, I mean, when you look at who's actually committing homicides against African Americans, you'll find that it's other African Americans overwhelmingly. And the police issues are largely involving people that are suspects in felony crimes and are resisting arrest, or sometimes cases of mistaken identity, or, for instance, a lady in Louisville, Kentucky had a boyfriend, I think it was a drug dealer, and there was a police raid, and he shot at the police, and the police returned fire, and she was killed in the crossfire, which is a tragic incident. But again, I mean, when you're living with a drug dealer, and you are taking on a certain risk. And I think so. The whole crying claim of BLM here is just completely nonsense. I mean, obviously, we want police that are well trained and disciplined and can carry out the law appropriately. But when you have over 700,000 police officers and law enforcement officials in the country, obviously there's going to be mistakes are made. I mean, there are probably more deaths due to medical malpractice by far than there are due to police malpractice, as an example. And yet the doctors are some of the most highly trained professionals in the world. and yet mistakes still get made in hospitals. And so I think that people should show a little bit of reason here. And I think when you see how unreasonable they're being, you can tell that there's a hidden agenda here, that they really aren't on the side of truth. They're not on the side of justice. They're on the side of disruption and causing trouble for the country. And so I think while we agree that all lives matter, including, of course, Black lives, we definitely realize that the BLM organization, the people funding it, have objectives that are antithetical to the American way of life. And so people should behave appropriately, respect this group, and not support them. Thank you.